Our next speaker for session 2 is Dr. Jeff Myers, known affectionately around here as Dr. Jeff. And Dr. Jeff is the president of Summit Ministries. In the last 20 years, he has become one of America's most respected authorities on youth leadership development. And boy, does that show with our students here at Summit. He's made a ton of appearances, media appearances in the last year, doing great work on informing others just about all that's going on. He holds a Doctor of Philosophy degree and teaches colleges, universities, of course, here at Summit. Lives right here in Colorado with his family, a couple of which are here with us today, including his best canine pal, Clive. Yeah, come on, Dr. Jeff. He's going to talk to us about freedom under attack.
Thank you, Megan. Wow, great to see you guys tonight. I'm excited to have people literally from all over the world. You wouldn't necessarily know this if you were just watching online, but there are people from 25 different countries participating in this event tonight. And so your experience with religious freedom may be very different from the things we're talking about that happen in the United States of America. But I'm going to try to give a little bit of a historical approach, and then also talk about what we can and should be doing. I mean, how do you talk about religious freedom with your friends and neighbors? Let's say it comes up around the water cooler at work. Some of the things that John was talking about, that would be a pretty scary conversation that might actually end your job. So how do you articulate these things in a good way and also get a good history to it? Before we dive into all of this, though, I've got a poll for you. I'd love for you to tell me where you are currently in your thoughts about being a defender of religious freedom. So if you were to be asked to talk about religious liberty with a neighbor, where would you be? I can confidently explain why it's important. I know why it's important, but I'm a little rusty in explaining how. I'm pretty sure I would fumble the ball, or I would avoid the topic if at all possible. What do you think about religious liberty? Oh, squirrel, right? Yeah. Okay, take a look at that. This is really amazing. So you've got almost 40% say I can confidently explain why it's important. A little bit rusty, about the same size of a group. Pretty sure I'd fumble the ball. Thank you for your honesty on that, by the way, because we don't have these programs just because we already know all of the answers and we want to celebrate that fact. We have programs like this because we want to learn and grow. So thank you for that. And I would avoid the topic if at all possible. Yeah, there are a lot of people who really do think that and feel that. But I'd like to talk about religious liberty in the context of what I think is the biggest battle that we face in our culture at this time. I do believe we have a conflict in our culture, and I do not believe the biggest conflict of our time is the conflict between Democrats and Republicans, or the conflict between blue states and red states, or the conflict between the non-religious and the religious, or the conflict between liberals and conservatives. The biggest conflict that we face in our time is really two conflicting views of truth. One view, the classical view, says that truth can be known, that we can, truth can be known. The other view says truth cannot be known. So the truth can be known view, sort of the classical view, says that ultimate truth exists independent of us and can be discovered, though not perfectly, through reason and revelation. Our job is to persuade others to respond to it. But the most prominent view of our time says that the truth cannot be known. Ultimate truth is up to the individual. No one is in a position to discover ultimate truth. The best we can do is speak our truth. If you heard people talk like this, speak our truth and try to get the power to compel others to see it our way. It used to be the case that you would use facts and figures and logical arguments, and people would say, oh, I'm coming to understand the truth. In fact, the famous Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to say, you may be entitled to your own opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts. But the postmodern professor, Stanley Fish, who's one of the most significant voices in the world of English literature and in law today, said you are entitled to your own facts if you can make your version of them stick. And 58% of Americans believe this. In fact, we are right at the 50% mark among church-going, born-again Christians who say they believe that truth is up to the individual. Obviously, someone who believes that no absolute truth exists, the truth is up to the individual, would have very little respect for religious liberty. This is a totally different poll, but the percentage is exactly the same. 58% of Americans do not believe that religious liberty is actually being threatened today. But think of this, 51% of Americans say the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is outdated and should be rewritten. Not only that we don't really care about religious liberty, but we think religious liberty and even free speech and freedom of the press should be abolished. Well, I first started thinking about this when I came to be president of Summit Ministries. You may remember this case from several years ago. In the Obama administration, there was a ruling that came down that said organizations like ours that provide health care insurance for our employees must provide certain kinds of contraceptives they're called in the class of contraceptives, but they're really not. They're abortifacients. They're drugs that cause a chemically induced abortion. And we would be forced to pay for these even though we take a stance against abortion. We're wholly committed to a pro-life viewpoint at Summit Ministries. And so we started looking at what the consequences of this would be. And it is a pretty extraordinary thing. We found that if we did not comply with the Obama-era mandates, we would face fines of $36,500 a year per employee. That would be fines that we would have to pay at Summit Ministries at the time with 36 employees, $1.3 million a year in fines because we do not want to pay for abortifacients as part of our health care plan. Now, the crazy thing, and to show you that this was intentionally mean-spirited, the fine for not providing health insurance at all was only $2,000 a year. So you tell me what the administration was really trying to communicate. Because to us, it was very clear what they're trying to communicate to us is you will comply with our viewpoint on the issue of abortion regardless of what you believe. We were fortunate in this situation that the Hobby Lobby company went to court and they were able to prevail against this, which turned the tide. But John, a little bit earlier, mentioned a group called the Little Sisters of the Poor. This is a group of elderly nuns who care for poor people. And they were forced by the federal government at the cost of potentially millions of dollars of fines to buy contraceptives as part of their health care plan for their members. This is the theater of the absurd. But this is where things go when the government takes on a particular view. Now, why would they take that view? We'll get to that in just a moment. But I want to ask, first of all, the question that I think a lot of people probably tonight are asking, which is, you have the right to attend services. What are you complaining about? Now, this may not be true in the country that you're a part of. There are people from certain countries who are with us tonight. And I say tonight because it's tonight here in Colorado. I know it might be morning for you. You actually live in a closed country. And I won't even say the names of some of the countries, because I don't know what your situation is. You may not even have the ability to participate in religious services. I know I just looked a little bit ago, and there are 26 people from Canada who are with us tonight. And you probably have seen the news items of churches that are under threat, especially I noticed in the province of Alberta. So this may not be the situation for you at the present time. But when people say, you have the right to attend services, what are you complaining about? They're ignoring the fact that religious freedom and the right to worship are not the same thing. John, thank you for pointing that out and making that such a key part of your presentation. But Timothy Shaw is a professor at Baylor University, and he's been able to show in his work that the right to religious freedom is the heart of all other rights. That countries that protect religious freedom also protect economic freedom and civil rights and political freedom and women's rights and so forth. So let me give you a little history of how this works in the United States of America. Religious freedom in the United States of America was part of America's founding. And it was for reasons that a lot of people don't really know very much about. One of the things the founders of the United States were concerned about is that a state church, and that would mean a national church, would enable Britain to retain its power over the colonies. They were specifically concerned about the Anglican Church. Now, John, I'm sorry, I don't mean to pick on Anglicans here. And our other speaker is British, so I don't mean to pick on the Brits either. And the two of you who are watching from the UK right now, I don't mean to pick on you, but the founders of the United States of America were very concerned that if there was going to be a national church, it would end up being Anglican, and the pastors would be British, and they would be spies for the British government. That's what they were concerned with. And I can demonstrate that with a quote from a founding father here in just a minute. The second thing they realized is that religion helps sustain the virtue people need to be good citizens. It's fascinating that a sociologist named Brian Grimm looked into this, and he discovered that when you take the value of all of the services that congregations of faith provide in the United States of America, you are looking at $1.2 trillion in economic value every year. That is the amount of, that's more money than the top 10 largest tech corporations in the world make every year. That is more money than all but 14 countries of the world have as their total income as a nation. And that's simply just what Americans do every day who are people of faith. Third thing, the founders said that religion is best protected by a free market. A lot of people don't realize that when America was founded, church attendance was very low. I think it was about 17%, according to one study I saw. When the founders said, we're not going to have a national church, we're going to let people make their own case. If you have a church and you want people to come, make the case. And so they began doing this, and church attendance tripled as a result of that free market of religion. And then finally, the founders believed that restrictions on religious freedom lead to restrictions on other freedoms. And this is true all over the world. If you see religious freedom under attack, that is a tell that the people who are in power intend to attack economic and political freedom as well. John Adams, when he was asked years and years after the founding about how the issue of religious liberty affected all of these conversations, he said the apprehension of episcopacy, in other words, their concerns about the Anglican Church, contributed 50 years ago as much as any other cause to arouse the attention not only of the inquiring mind, but of the common people, and to urge them to close thinking on the constitutional authority of Parliament over the colonies. So they put together, as soon as they passed the Constitution, they also passed the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So when you hear people talk about religious freedom as the first freedom, that's why, because it's the first thing mentioned in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. And then it goes on to talk about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to peaceably assemble, and the freedom to petition government. Let me ask you real quickly, just take up this quick poll. Which First Amendment liberty do you feel is most under threat? Would you say freedom of religion? Or maybe you would say freedom of speech, or freedom of the press, or freedom to peaceably assemble, or freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances. I'm just curious what you would say about that. Because there's quite a bit of debate, and I have a feeling that there's probably a lot of diversity in the way people are thinking of this in the event tonight. Does it take a minute for the results to come up, or is that? Maybe people aren't quite voting yet, or they're saying all of them. How do I vote for all? It's not fair. You only vote one, okay? All right. As we're waiting for those poll results to come up, I want to talk a little bit about the very idea of liberty. Let me give you a definition of liberty. Liberty is freedom from undue restraint. Freedom from undue restraint. Edmund Burke was a British parliamentarian. He actually witnessed the French Revolution. And he said, but what is liberty without wisdom and without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils, for it is folly, vice, and madness without tuition or restraint. That you have to have a certain moral core in order to really have liberty. Liberty is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It's the freedom to do what you ought to do. There are two concepts of liberty, one that was held by our founders and one that is held by people today. The first concept of liberty, negative liberty. Now it sounds like that's the bad one, right? Because it's negative. No, it's the other way around. The founders asked the question, what external restraints make it hard for people to secure liberty, and how might we remove those restraints? John earlier mentioned the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This act was passed in Congress by almost a unanimous vote. It was signed into law by President Bill Clinton. As John mentioned, in the Senate, the bill was carried forward by Ted Kennedy. In the House, it was carried forward by a representative who is now a senator you may have heard of, named Chuck Schumer. Okay, so Ted Kennedy, Bill Clinton, Chuck Schumer, three well-known conservatives, right? No, there was almost a universal sense that we need to protect religious freedom at that time. So in the United States, current law says that religious freedom must be protected by the federal government, except in extreme cases where the government has a compelling interest in restricting it. For example, if a religious group calls for violence against the citizenry, and it must do so by the least restrictive means. That's the idea of negative liberty. The second concept, and the one that's held by a lot of people today, and I think it leads to a lot of the conflicts that we have about religious liberty today, is the idea of positive liberty. It doesn't ask, how do we get the government out of the way? It asks, how do we insert the government to protect people from themselves by removing inequality between people or people groups? So right now, before the United States Senate, there is an act that is under consideration. It's called H.R. 5. It is also known as the Equality Act. This act says that the traditional civil rights laws of the United States of America that protect people based on race, sex, and religion, that's going to be changed. Added to that would be gender identity and sexual orientation. So no longer are your protections based on the race that you were born with, or the sex that you were born with, or the religion that you grew up with. Instead, it all comes back to how you feel about yourself. What do I believe my identity to be? And then I will tell you whether or not my freedoms are being protected. This is an example of the positive liberty idea. And it's specifically in the bill, and you can read it online, says the Religious Freedom Restoration Act shall not provide a claim concerning or a defense to a claim under a covered title or provide a basis for challenging the application or enforcement of a covered title. In short, what that means is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is gone, and religious freedom can no longer be used as a defense if someone says that the claims they're making are based on their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Now, how did we even get to this place? Well, if you look back over the history of Supreme Court cases starting in the 1940s, you can see a big shift from separation of church and state to suppression of religious freedom. And this is a long list. By the way, I should have told you this up front. The notes are available. When you look in your app there, I think, what is it? What does it say? Does it say materials or resources? Resources. Okay, there's a tab that says resources and the notes are available. Some of you are like, we needed to know that 15 minutes ago. But they're there. So they're all there. But just look at this. In 1947, the court said there needs to be a wall of separation between church and state. 1962, government-sponsored school prayer violates the Constitution. 1963, mandatory Bible reading violates the Constitution. 1971, government may not pay the salaries of teachers in religious schools, even if they teach only secular subjects. 1980, display of the Ten Commandments in public schools violates the Constitution. Now look at this. This is where you start to see the shift. 1985, a period of silence for prayer in public schools violates the Constitution. Clergy-led prayer at public school graduations violates the Constitution. And you say, well, students can still do it. Nope, 2000, student-led, student-initiated prayer violates the Constitution. By 2010, recognized Christian groups on college campuses cannot disallow people who do not hold their beliefs from leadership. So if an atheist says, I want to run and be the president of the Christian Legal Society, they have to be permitted to do it. You see how we went from separation to suppression? And this case, most recently, is an interesting one because it was denied review by the Supreme Court. Kennedy versus Bremerton School District. A public school coach may be fired for publicly observing a moment of silent prayer after a football game. From separation of church and state to the suppression of religious viewpoints. Now, as we get ready to wrap this up here, let me give you some good news because temporarily there is some good news. A recent study came out that showed that from 1953 to 1969, what's called the Warren Court, when the Chief Justice was named Earl Warren, religious organizations won 46% of the relevant cases before the court. From 2005 to the present, with John Roberts as the Chief Justice, religious organizations have won 81% of the relevant cases. We also discovered in the study that judges appointed by former President Donald Trump have sided with religious interests 72% of the time. Democrat-appointed judges had done so just 10% of the time. So when people say, I think this is a partisan issue, I think this is an issue of Republicans versus Democrats as well as other things, you can see exactly why they might say that. One of the people who has done a good job standing for religious freedom in the Supreme Court is Judge Neil Gorsuch, who's from Colorado. And this was not a case in which religious interests prevailed, but the case was called Calvary Chapel. It was in the court. It was in the state of Nevada. But Judge Gorsuch put it this way. He said, "The world we inhabit today, with the pandemic upon us, poses unusual challenges, but there is no world in which the Constitution permits Nevada to favor Caesar's palace over Calvary Chapel." I just love the way he framed that, because that is exactly the issue that we're facing. Well, the positive liberty idea that the government is going to stop trying to get out of the way of people's freedom and instead start inserting itself to try to meet a particular definition of equality based on sexual orientation and gender identity is now officially part of the law of the land. President Biden on January 20th, 2021 signed an executive order on preventing and combating discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. So that is already the law of the land at the federal government. Now, listen, what do we do? How do we respond to this? There are three things that I would suggest, and I know we've got somebody from Alliance Defending Freedom who's going to be presenting here in a little bit, and you're going to have some great dialogue with him as well. But first of all, I think it's really significant to understand the importance of religious liberty and to be prepared to defend it. To be able to say things like this: we don't hate anyone, we love freedom. And attacks on religious freedom pave the way for attacks on all freedoms, so I invite you to stand with me, even if you're not religious. I think that's a fair thing to be able to say around the water cooler. Second, to confront the idea that religious liberty is a cloak for an anti-LGBTQ agenda. John mentioned this, but I think we need to be prepared to somehow say it, and here's one way. Our convictions are based in facts, not feelings. You don't have to agree, but you may not silence us. And then third, to prepare our organizations to stand for what we believe. At Summit Ministries, we know that some of the programs that we do, the stand that we take on marriage and life and all of these kinds of things, and on having our primary identity as our relationship with Christ and not our sexuality, all of these kinds of things can get us into a lot of trouble. So we had a meeting very much like this with our entire Summit staff. And when we pulled everybody together, I said, here's the deal, gang. If we are accused of holding the convictions that we hold, we want there to be plenty of evidence to convict us. Because we don't want to be in a position of, say, some Christian universities that are saying, oh, you have to protect our religious freedom because we stand for marriage. And the court's going to look at that and say, well, you have 10 professors there who've stood against that for 25 years. How can you possibly make that claim now? If there ever was a time to stand firm in your convictions, it's now. One of the legal heroes I've just always respected through time, so articulate, was Judge Learned Hand. He said this: I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much on constitutions, upon laws, upon courts, these are false hopes. Believe me, these are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women, and when it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it. We've got to be people who understand the times and know what our nation ought to do. Thanks. Thanks for your time. Megan?
Yes.
Right.
I have this huge pile of things right here, but we did get that poll up, so if you'd like to see
Oh, you
the
did?
results.
Oh, yes,
yeah,
please.
it was really interesting.
I didn't know what to do because I was thinking, should I go on or should I wait? And sometimes
Well, here you go.
technology's not
You did great.
not awesome. Okay. All right. Which First Amendment liberties do you feel are under threat? 32% say freedom of religion. 60% say freedom of speech. That's interesting. Only 2% say freedom of the press. So
That's
journalists
right.
are safe, I guess.
They're doing all right.
Yeah. You're a journalist, so I won't say anything negative about journalists right now.
Thanks.
On camera. Freedom to peaceably assemble, 5%. Freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances, 2%. So it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear those first two freedoms are the ones that really seem to be under attack the most.
Yeah, and people are aware and concerned about it.
Yeah.
I have a question here that's really great, but I have a prior question to that. Why is it snowing in May in Colorado?
Did you all
This is a real
notice?
question.
Some of you are from countries where it's 95 degrees and 95% humidity right now.
Yeah, I feel like being from
So
Georgia.
you're probably wondering why we're all wearing sweaters. Because it is snowing outside. I'm not joking. It snowed all day, didn't it?
It did.
Here in Manitou Springs, Colorado.
We're all a little perplexed, but okay, serious question. From Julie LeQuay. Hi, Julie, by the way. When Christians continue to support government welfare or even participate in welfare programs, does this support and participation undermine the good being done through the church and by individual Christians? And she has a little bit of a second part. So because of this, is it harmful for Christians to participate in government welfare programs or support those programs?
Okay, so I don't want to be too theoretical about this,
Sure.
but there's a
It's a good
framework. This is what is coming into my mind when I answer a question like this. I go back to this guy who was for a very short period of time the prime minister of the Netherlands, named Abraham Kuyper. And he talked about the idea of sphere sovereignty. Now, different people say there are different spheres of society, and some people say schools are a sphere, and family, and church, and the state, and commerce. Historically, Christians have said there are three dominant spheres. You have the state, the government, the family, and the church. Those three spheres, Kuyper said, have to be in balance with one another. So if you go back to the Medicis in Italy, where the family sphere got bigger, it's like a balloon, so the other two balloons get squeezed. You've also had times in history where the church exceeded the bounds of its natural sphere and civil government and families were hurt. It seems to me that we're in a place now where the civil government has expanded to the point where families and churches get hurt. So there ought to, in theory, be a way for the government to work together with families and with churches to accomplish the things that it needs to do. So here's a specific example that I think gets to answering your question, Julie, so let's say the government looks around and says, there are lots of foster kids. So what do? Okay, the government could say, we're going to build orphanages, and we will have government-run orphanages, and we will house all of the children there. A wiser government would ask, can families help with this? Can churches help with this? And the answer is yes, they can. If you look at the number of children who are in the foster care system in the state of Colorado, it's almost exactly the same as the number of churches there are in the state of Colorado. So if every church said, we'll help with one kid, and we're going to find a family who can take that kid in, and we'll help them financially buy groceries or whatever they need to help take care of that child, then you've got a situation where a respectful government recognizes the power of the church and the family. But at the same time, there's wide agreement in all of the nations that are represented tonight in their countries that there ought to be some kind of a social safety net, that we've agreed to pay taxes so that the government can help people so they don't fall through the cracks in our society. But once again, a wise government is the one that's going to ask, how can we take the natural spheres of our society and do this in a more natural way rather than starting a new government program? And especially Washington, D.C. I mean, I don't mean to complain politically, but every dollar you send to Washington, D.C., only 30% of it ever comes back out to help people. 70% gets chewed up in the bureaucracy. That's not the case in churches.
No.
You know, people who give money to Summit Ministries, 81% comes right back out to ministry.
Right.
With churches, it's the same kind of a thing. Very low administrative cost, very high on ministering to people.
Right. John said the same kind of thing when he was talking about all the things that churches are doing with relief efforts and things like that.
Right.